Well, I'm glad you were get here. Well, you're over. You must be over near the UN somewhere.
That's
huh?
exactly right.
Off Second Avenue. Somewhere?
First Avenue.
Oh, right at First Avenue.
Yeah.
Right at
46th.
46th, right?
Mhm.
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
It's interesting you're located near the UN. Huh? Welcome very much to Conversations. Well, it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Charles Heck. And Mr. Heck is the North American Director of the Trilateral Commission. And we're going to be talking about the state of the world and that institution with Mr. Heck. And Charles Heck, welcome very much to Conversations.
Well, thank you, Harold, for having me here.
Oh, we talked again. It was some years back. We had a conversation about state of the world at that time and so forth. But I wonder, maybe you could. The Trilateral Commission is a major institution, and I wonder maybe you could say the historical development of it, what its charge and raison d'etre is, and then we could talk from that perspective somewhat about world affairs and some of the developments as seen from a trilateral perspective. But could you share the beginning of the institution and its involvement?
Sure. The Trilateral Commission was launched in the middle of 1973. The idea germinated over 2 years or so before then, and I suppose there were several main ideas that were in the heads of the founders. Perhaps the most immediate idea was that this was a time of some friction among the governments of Europe, North America, and Japan.
Sure.
So the organizers were trying to put together the highest level discussion group they could of people who were not in the governments of the day, but in many cases close to the governments of the day, to think about the big issues that all these three democratic industrialized regions face, and to try to move the dialogue in a more cooperative direction.
These were people that were not in the government, but perhaps had been or are likely to be in the government, or in institutions that are closely aligned with those responsible for the governments of the QC.
That's right. We're very much an unofficial, non-governmental organization, and the thought was when you step into your national cabinet, you don't speak for yourself anymore. You speak for a government, and so what this organization tries to do is leaven thinking, leaven debate from a step or two outside government. But aside from that immediate idea, there were several other ideas certainly on the minds of the founders. I suppose the most unusual one at the time was the prominence given to Japan in the construction of this organization. There were networks like this across the Atlantic between Europeans and North Americans, but there had not been an organization like this that included from the beginning the Japanese as one of three equal parts, and certainly that was one of the large political purposes of the organization, to help bring Japan along. I mean, Japan was surging ahead at that time, and had become quite a big fish in the international pond, and needed to think about the leadership responsibilities that came from becoming a bigger fish in the international pond.
Yeah, that's right.
On the other hand, thinking of the early 1970s, the founders were impressed that the United States was no longer and would never again be, in the thinking of that time, in such a singular position as we had been in the decades right after the Second World War, to sort of manage the system.
Right, that's right.
So a more collective form of leadership was going to be needed to make the broader system function reasonably well, and so the notion was that Europe, North America, and Japan constituted the core areas for this broader form of leadership for the system.
And that was the tri in the trilateral.
That's the tri, right. And that was also a particularly interesting time for Europe, actually, if we look back at it. In 1973, the year that we started, that was the year that Britain came into the European community, finally, along with Denmark and Ireland. So the European community by that time included the all the great powers, if you will,
Yeah.
in Western Europe, and so the Trilateral Commission on the European side has been based on the notion along the way of an integrating Europe, playing a larger role on the global stage,
Right, right.
and with Britain in the European community at that time, some of those notions surged ahead. So it was a very interesting historical moment, and I suppose the other idea that was very much on the minds of the founders was that interdependence was growing by leaps and bounds, and the game of diplomacy was no longer quite so classical in character.
Yes.
There were issues of interdependence, of managing the international economy, of the oil shocks soon after we got started.
We were in the middle of it then,
of
weren't we?
the environment.
Yes.
that were going to have to move up on the international agenda and become central issues alongside the more classical matters of foreign policy that had tended to occupy State departments and diplomats.
Geostrategic thinking,
And perhaps that was perhaps a particularly interesting moment in the early 1970s, in that it was a time of détente with the old Soviet Union.
Right, right.
And so there was a sense that the system might be changing in some important ways, though we went back into a more Cold War situation late in the 70s.
Oh, I
and
see. That's
had another 15 years
That was a
of
little
Cold
thaw
War.
or something.
A little thaw in the early 70s that didn't quite work out.
Right, right. That one did not, but it was in that, and we were in that bipolar view of the world with Mr. Kennan and containment and so forth, as geostrategically was involved in our thinking. And I wonder if we talked to this, and the thing is, you said that there had been traditionally certain ties between Europe and the United States.
Yes.
In terms of an organization that gave advice to governments and that sort of thing. What would some of those predecessor agencies have been? We hear of Bilderberger.
Yes.
Yeah. And others. Or what were the ones that had the kind of charge that Trilateral has began with and has taken on in terms of taking a large-scale view of, global developments? Or some of the predecessor agencies that could be aligned to the mission that Trilateral does have?
Right. Well, there was, you mentioned Bilderberg. The Bilderberg annual meetings had been going since the middle of the 1950s.
Okay.
Drawing in North Americans and NATO countries in Europe. And actually, when David Rockefeller, who was the principal founder of Trilateral, was thinking about trying to bring Japan more into the middle of the international debate, David Rockefeller actually proposed in Bilderberg that Bilderberg itself be, this was before Trilateral was created, Bilderberg be expanded to include Japan.
That's interesting. He had that idea right then.
But
when would it might have been made? I mean, just off the top of your head,
around. That would have been in 71 and 72.
Earlier, right, okay.
And then it was when that idea was rejected within Bilderberg that actually that was part of the birth then of the Trilateral Commission.
That's very interesting, isn't it?
That Mr. Rockefeller certainly saw the need for Japan to be drawn in this way, and it wasn't going to happen in Bilderberg. So that was part of the genesis then of creating this separate organization.
Could you tell us why, or what do you think it is that the Bilderberg as an organization didn't see the wisdom of that? Do you think, or does it tell us anything about the thinking regionally or otherwise?
Well, I suppose it does say something about the thinking at that time.
Yeah.
And certainly some of the Europeans were not yet at that stage embracing Japan in quite the way that many Americans were as a core area of the international system.
It had been an Axis nation.
Oh, it had been.
And we came out of the Second War, and
that's true.
The Marshall Plan had come, and there had been that development of those nations that had, in a sense, been defeated in a Great World War, and yet we were building them up. So there was a leap of faith, or a leap of something that was expressed in the Marshall Plan, which was very wise, it seems to us, that we developed those areas. But there might have been some lag just based on That kind of thinking, or am I thinking off base?
Well, and the Europeans had not developed, I mean, the United States developed quite an intimate relationship with Japan after the Second World War.
Right, quick after.
We occupied Japan for a few years.
Yeah.
So we were deeply involved with Japan in many ways, but those links did not exist.
That's interesting, yeah.
between Europe and Japan.
It's interesting. We're between the two.
So Japan wasn't in the consciousness of Europeans as much as it was in the consciousness of Americans. So I think that made it less natural from a European perspective to want to bring Japan into the circle, along with the Americans.
Well, it's interesting that he proposed that early on. It had been rejected, and then it led to the Trilateral, which was also intellectually led, if that's correct. I'm not sure. Set me straight again. A major force was Zbigniew Brzezinski.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, Zbigniew Brzezinski was the main intellectual dynamo, I like to say, of those early years.
And he's still on the advisory board, I believe.
He's still on the executive committee, right? And still, and his. As usual, producing lots of good ideas.
Well, I said I brought in a book. I just read of his. He's got a new one out, the Grand Chessboard. He's written a new book recently, which is well worth reading and so forth. But he's there. And so, okay, I didn't mean to interrupt you at the flow. Other organizations that are similar to the charge that you have, either historically that were antecedent to Trilateral, were there others that were major? We've had the Council on, and
Council, well, the Council on Foreign Relations, right, was a. I mean, has always been a U.S.-centered organization. It's a much larger organization, but its core is the United States and U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
The Council has debated within itself at times whether it should broaden its membership to include some non-Americans, but the conclusion was not to do that. So the Council remains its 3,000 or so members are based here, are Americans. I suppose another organization that had a related purpose was something called the Atlantic Institute that doesn't exist anymore now. It was a research institute based in Paris, somewhat paired with something called the Atlantic Council of the United States that's based in Washington, and that still is quite very much alive. But both of those organizations again had an Atlantic focus, and came out of a slightly different era.
Yeah. It's been the traditional. That's a strong traditional tie back to Europe. It certainly has been.
It's a very strong tie, but particularly if you wanted to think about the whole world at that stage, you couldn't just do that from an Atlantic framework. You needed to draw in Japan at that stage, and if you were serious about thinking of management of the system more broadly, and one of the interesting things that has now happened in Trilateral, and I'm sure we'll get into that later, is that our Japan side has now been widened into a Pacific Asia side. East Asia has transformed itself in remarkable ways in the last 25 years or so.
There are a lot of things going on out there. The Tiger Nations, not to mention China, and that relationship, these kind of issues. So instead of it, where it has been Europe, North America, which included Canada, and now it's going to include Mexico. As I saw, they're going to bring that in since NAFTA, so that's North America. But then Europe had many nations, many countries that were involved with the Union, and then it had been Japan, but now it's going out to get some of the other countries as well, including looking at or setting up a relationship toward China.
It's a rather complicated
as complicated as the reality
out there in East Asia. Yes. We have our Japanese group of members. We have a Korean national group of members. We have an Australia, New Zealand group, and then from the there is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN.
All right. Yeah.
And the 5 original members of ASEAN, which began in the late 60s actually, are Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and the Philippines.
Yes.
And in this new Pacific Asia group within Trilateral, we have 15 individual members that are drawn from those basic 5 ASEAN countries, original 5 ASEAN countries, who have made tremendous progress over the last 3 decades or so toward becoming industrialized democracies themselves, even though things have gotten very complicated for them in just the last few years.
Yes, right. There's been a lot of complications. Yeah. Industrialized democracy is a thing. Wanted to get back at some of the ideas of the raison d'etre or the thinking, and certainly some of the principles. We want to get principles that are organizing principles for an institution, and democracy, industrialization, and development is one. But I wonder if we could still pick up on this theme about the antecedent institutions or institutions. We now have a process called globalization, which is absolutely transforming everything.
Yes.
And if it ever had called for a realization of the world that the trilateralists were trying to facilitate, is getting communication with the whole system's understanding of the world. But we now have a major gathering, if that's the right term, of people that is associated in the popular mind with Davos. They will get together in Davos, and there will be leaders, and the Trilateral is a leadership organization of the geopolitical or geostrategic or business community, understanding things that way. But you have Davos, and what I'm trying to get at in a certain sense for the citizens who might be viewing, the assemblages of not governments, but the assemblages of people that are concerned, or maybe some that would involve governments. I think some people from the government do involve themselves at Davos and so forth. The major institutions by which the people that have major responsibility for the system, global system, that we can identify. Certainly the Trilateral is one of the major ones. What are some of the sub-institutions, sister institutions, and maybe distinctions between them in terms of what differentiates them from each other and what unites them?
Right. Well, you know, if we looked at this on a very big canvas and thought of sister organizations in wider terms,
yes.
I mean, one of the very interesting things in the world over the last 25 years has been the virtual explosion of non-governmental organizations,
right? Okay,
including non-governmental organizations that that cross national borders in one way or another.
Oh, absolutely.
So in the broadest sense, I mean, the field is just absolutely more vigorously populated now than it was then, with all kinds of organizations that may worry about environmental issues or may worry about human rights. I mean, there are fascinating human rights organizations.
Right.
Or that may worry about some other particular issue, or may draw together particular types of people. It's been striking. I mean, after Trilateral was created, there were other organizations that were somewhat trilateral in character that might draw together journalists or might draw together business leaders in a particular sector or something.
Right. Well, there's been those, there've been those institutes, Oil Institute and things like that. But yeah.
Right. But those.
But I was trying to get at, if I could, the Trilateral, in the sense, has a view of the traditional thinking of geostrategic thinking, the relationship between the nations. Large governmental, and the membership. We could talk about the membership and how it's established. How do we determine how many members there are from each country, each region, and who are they? They tend to represent a certain group, and they tend to represent, in a certain sense, the leadership of the business and intellectual strategic thinking community, and that sort of thing is what I was getting at, really. And which I think they try to track that at Davos and other kinds of things, whereas the non-governmental organizations get very, very diverse in terms of and specialized in their interests. But this question of the leadership of the world system, or understanding it.
Right. That annual meeting that Davos has is quite remarkable. I mean, it has I think over 3,000 participants in this most recent meeting. We're quite small in comparison. I mean, our annual meeting will have perhaps 200 members present, and the overall membership is around 350 drawn from these 3 areas. There are 85 U.S. places in that membership, and we do indeed try to draw people who are in leadership positions in different aspects of society. So there will be many people from business and finance, but I mean, there are also some labor leaders involved. There are lawyers, some lawyers or media people involved. There are a number of people from research institutes or universities. There are a number of parliamentarians involved who are not in their national executive branches at the time.
Yeah. President Clinton was, I think, a member of Trilateralist, and then had to step down when he became president.
That's right.
Or President Carter had been a Trilateral.
That's right, exactly.
Person. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so you have that. So that is a quality of leadership. And that's one of the things I was trying to get at in a certain sense is, what are the criteria by which you decide who the trilateral members are within each regional group? What is it? I mean, is it intellectual understanding or definitive seminal works that they've done in an intellectual sense? Is it a position of business or financial power over major institutions? Or, you know, that's what in a sense I'm getting at. And then maybe how does that compare with other institutions which will try to bring together the leadership of understanding the system? And what about the differences that could exist between the members of the leadership elements that are involved in these organizations? There's differences between them just as there are between political parties and so forth. And how wide is the net of intellectual extension out beyond just one common accepted notion, and how much is there a core raison d'etre that they all can agree to, and some of the organizing principles that are involved and give a sense of commonality to the group quality of the grouping?
Right. Well, within Trilateral and in the U.S. group, we have a membership discussion every summer when the North American Planning Group gets together, and we have a rotation system in the U.S. group, so there are usually 5 to 10 openings each year, and we'll go into that meeting with a list of potential candidates that's a good bit longer than the number of openings we have.
Right.
And when we talk, we try to be balanced between Republicans and Democrats.
Okay, that's interesting. That's interesting in itself, yeah.
We try to have some regional balance, though we oftentimes don't do as well as we should in that regard. I mean, there is the biggest concentrations by far for U.S. members are in New York and Washington.
And that reflects the institutional bias, or the institutional relationships people have and the focus they have?
I suppose so, yes.
That's
right.
something we could maybe talk about.
But ideally we would not be quite so concentrated in the Washington, New York, Boston corridor as we are.
You're saying that's just sort of obiter dictum, like you're saying it might be better if you could expand out.
Right. I mean, if someone is in another part of the country, that's a positive factor. Just thinking.
Oh, I see.
You asked me about the factors that go into thinking about this. So one thinks about different sectors of the economy. One wants to, as I was mentioning, the membership includes some labor leaders as well as some business leaders.
That's interesting, yeah.
You try to make sure that you bring along some younger folks, that you don't, that the group doesn't become too old. That's certainly a challenge. For people from research institutes or universities, certainly you're looking for people who are among the best broad-minded thinkers of the era.
Yeah, it's just like every university has a process of vetting who they want to have as part of their faculty. That sort of thing is a traditional kind of thing that you have.
Right, and as to how this membership, our membership, would compare with the participants in Bilderberg or with the participants in Davos.
Yes. Those are two other institutions we could call it. There probably are others, but those are two, yeah.
Right, and I, looking at the Americans involved, at least, I don't. The mix in Davos would obviously be much bigger.
There are more people, for one thing. They'd have a wider criteria that they would draw upon, right?
And they're not quite. What they're up to is not quite so much what we're up to in terms of getting everybody to sit together and think about the same issues together for a while.
Right.
At least the annual meeting of Davos has an incredibly varied agenda and all sorts of things going on all kinds of topics. The Bilderberg group would be would I suppose have a similar mix to ours also, and one is trying in these organizations to span some divides. I mean, to consciously have some people who wouldn't have the same perspective, because
so there would be some diversity,
right? It's not the
but you want to find some overriding issues that you can find agreement in terms of.
That's right, but we don't try to press. I mean, for instance, we don't try to. We're not like like the Washington office of the National Association of Manufacturers or something.
Right,
who would take a position on a particular piece of legislation.
Right, you're trying to get
Congress.
at policy issues. You're trying to get at overarching policy issues and views. Yeah.
And the group is diverse enough that it wouldn't make sense to, and comes from many countries, so it wouldn't make sense to try to focus discussion on super detailed recommendations about what the British government or the Japanese government or the American government should do next.
Right.
So so we're trying to widen the horizons, widen the perspectives of the people that are involved, get them to understand more about how the other guy's thinking than they might have.
That's within their own country, their own region, and also within the world.
That's right. Although it's interesting how.
You have more trouble in home than you in the world, maybe sometimes.
It's sometimes very helpful within a country to have a group of people travel outside. For instance, one of the Canadians who's involved in our activity has been involved with the Canadian Parliament for many years, and he's talked about how important it is for Canadian parliamentarians from different parties to travel to a meeting outside Canada. And when they're outside Canada, they talk with each other in some ways more freely and have more of a sense of commonality in a way than they do when they're sitting back in Ottawa arguing about legislation.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Actually, one of the purposes of an organization like this can serve domestic purposes in that sense, as well as international purposes. I know several at times along the way, some Japanese have also said too that if you brought in someone from the United States or Europe, you could draw together a group of Japanese to talk with this person who might not Japanese who might not otherwise be speaking with each other particularly actively.
Right. There's some interesting synergies you can get, and the trilateral part or within it, But it is trying to be a representation of leadership thinking in terms of broad, systems understanding of the major challenges that confront the governments and the business leadership of the world. You did say labor, and then also we've had a transformation in our economy with this old and new economy.
That's
and you would try and reach out to some of the, I wonder if you would, reach out to some of the traditional, reach out to some of the new economy digerati, Mr. Gates, or some of the people that are becoming so important now because these new technologies are becoming very important in economic terms, in power terms in that sense.
That's right. We have not done...
And that you want to take into account, the realities of the world, not just ideology.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. And reaching out to some of these new ones is part of it. You mentioned labor, but reaching out to some of the new information technology people is something that this organization is cognizant of.
We have not done as well at that as we should have, but that's a very important very important thing to do. I have the impression that some of the Davos meetings have done well in that regard, but no, that's a very those are industries that are transforming the world in their way, and the people that lead those industries need to be thinking about some of these broader issues.
Yeah, there was an incredibly interesting article in Atlantic the other day where they had it was called the New Old Economy, and they were talking about what some of these new technologies meant to the oil industry. And it has absolutely fundamentally transformed the old hard rock mining concepts and the oil, the way it's done, and some of the policy, because they can just go with these new technologies and have pictures right inside the earth at a fraction of the cost that it used to be. And we have people like George Gilder who's coming along and saying things about, we now have, he has his new book, Telecosm, saying we're coming up with unlimited bandwidth. And there are a lot of transformations that are taking place that would want to be, I suppose, included within the thinking of people that are concerned with the, with the stewardship, if that's the right term, of the political and economic systems of the planet.
No, you're right, and it is interesting how how there is tremendous technological progress. You're right in some of the older industries too, and the oil example you mentioned. It's amazing now what one can. The so-called, I don't understand a great deal about this,
it's going so fast,
the so-called 3D seismic pictures that can be taken, and you can, when you're dropping when you're drilling now, or when you're dropping a well, you can
do it with great accuracy and go sideways and everything. Yeah, and it's just transformed the industry, and it's cutting back on the employment necessary. I mean, things are changing. I guess that's an overworked term, but it really is. And you want to keep up with the change, but at the same time, you want to keep tied to the old moorings that have served well and so forth. And you want to provide a pattern that there can be commonality of agreement on. Among the trilateralists, there will be agreement that a democratization process on the planet is something that is to be encouraged in the long-run interests of the people of the planet. So trying to get at some of the universals that would be some moorings or commonality moorings that trilateralists and other people of good faith would, or good intention would have. Looking at it a little differently.
Right. Well, I think on the democracy front, I think you would find that if we had a sampling of members sitting with us, that those values are very important to people. I think there would be considerable differences about how actively you promote those values, or how you go about promoting them. I suppose if there were one element that drew people together, it would be some sense of it being very important to think about the international system and their country in this international system in a broad way. That it is dangerous to be excessively nationalist. It is dangerous to be isolationist. That, I mean, not only is that not good for my country, whatever the country is, but it's not the way the broader world is going to function.
That's right. Increasingly, globalization. The states are becoming more, as Mr. Zbigniew Brzezinski put it, more permeable. It's like every cell is semi-permeable in an organism that's becoming less and less, the traditional thinking of geopolitics and national interest being the sole criteria by which, the decision makers are to be made is not practicable increasingly in the way that it traditionally has been, perhaps, in terms of some of the realpolitik thinking and so forth.
I think that's right. It's a much more complex world in that sense. And I'm sure that a broad characterization of the membership of Trilateral would include a rather strong sense that we have to think about this system in big broad terms.
Right. Well, if they're not going to do it there, where are they? Or there would be somebody's should be thinking of things that way. In a sense, that's an intellectual charge that is there in the body, as far as humanity is concerned, is to get some of these systems understanding in order to try and understand and move things in an appropriate direction. Go ahead.
Just to add one point there, which I think is an important one. Sometimes when my fellow American citizens think about these things, they think that somehow or other one is discarding the national interest in favor of some big, woolly, broad international interest. But I think if we had a sampling of Trilateral members here and quizzed them about this, they would argue, as certainly I would argue too, that it is in the best interest of the best national interest of the United States or of the Netherlands or of Japan to think about what we're doing in the world in broad terms, and to try to look around the corner a little bit rather than just thinking about what is most immediately in our interest in any particular situation, because it certainly is in it is in our national interest that there be a reasonably functioning international system.
Yes, right.
So you
particularly in an age of globalization, you might as well be in touch with the realities that the industry and the world is bringing to you.
Right.
That is part of a realistic kind of reading, because sometimes the idealism of thinking systems and thinking in terms of other principles is derided by people who say, you know, realpolitik kind of thinking.
Right.
Well, you're familiar with the tradition of geostrategic thinking and that sort of thing. That's a big issue, what some of the universal principles are. And then it comes into, I saw a program, I mentioned to you on the program, there was a program on C-SPAN. They have incredibly good programs. They had all the trade representatives from the past administrations. It was a very interesting program. And I know one of your members has just been appointed, the new trade representative. And in a certain sense, seems to me that as the globalization happens and the economy becomes more and more important, the trade representative for the United States becomes a very important position, more so than it traditionally has been. But they were all there, and one of them made a comment, and they said that they recognize that there is growing and sort of what they called a free-floating and growing anxiety among the people of this country and of the world, and it's something that people in positions of leadership had to be aware of. They identified it and said, they were saying there's some people who object to, let's say, globalization or trade, let's say, in the fact that they're going to lose their position, their job, to a factory that's going to locate in a low-income, low-labor, low, you know, environmental standards place overseas or something. But that this is something, and they all agreed that there is like a free-floating angst that is becoming widespread, and it's something that has to be addressed. It was interesting to me that they did that. They did say that most of that difficulty, let's say from somebody in the United States, it wasn't that they were shipped overseas so much as it was technological displacement of labor in the production process, and that there was that. But they all recognize this as something that is existing as part of the charge of the trade representatives and of the people who are setting the broad agenda. Do you think that's an accurate reading of that there is free-floating angst, and it's growing among the citizens of the United States and of the world? And if so, where does it come from, and what are the implications to the world's leadership decision makers?
Oh, I think those are profoundly important questions.
Well, that's what you try to deal with.
Yeah, I think there is that kind of angst, and I think it's almost inevitable that there would be in this kind of world when you have a sense that you're interacting with a much bigger set of folks out there. Your own economy is embedded in a much bigger economy and can be affected by a big wide set of actors, and that sort of changes the parameters in which, I mean, it on the one hand it provides tremendous opportunity,
yes,
and allows for economic growth that could not happen if you were an isolated group. But on the other hand, it does make for a more rapidly changing, somewhat more turbulent situation, and that's adjusting our societies, even adjusting ourselves as individuals to that kind of world is a complicated thing. I mean, most people now, in comparison to the little town in Ohio where I grew up, most people now will change their careers several times in the course of their life. The skills that they learned early in their life may not be the skills that they need 15 or 20 years later.
Right.
So we're all needing to education is becoming a lifelong exercise. The safety nets in society become more important in some ways.
And they also become eroded in many ways in traditional
right.
thinking in the name of certain kinds of economic principles, which would get around to an understanding of the view of the leadership on questions of economics and
Yes.
even of economic theorizing and so forth, and what the trends are and what the trends are likely to be. Are we, if we stay the course and keep the way we're going now within the traditional thinking, let's just say, for instance, the trilateral people have a mooring in terms of traditional thinking. They don't want to get, it's like a big ocean liner going through. You can't move on a dime. You have to have a responsibility for the moorings, but also that there might be something new that is required in order to, in a certain way, be able to see some sort of a transformation, maybe at a traditional theoretical level or something like that. One would be the idea that the relationship of labor, because these trade representatives said it's not trade within low-income, low-wage labor places, it's technological displacement. And the technological displacement could be coming, and our economic policy, for instance, is the Employment Act of 1946, and we're going to distribute all income according to labor criteria, that is employment, and yet the technology, we read George Gilder or others, we read the technology with super cybernation and displacement and super automation and nanotechnology and so forth can become increasingly, in a systems way, displacing of labor in a way that there's not going to be an opening for the new labor to come along like the automobile workers were able to find after they left the farms. If you understand what I mean, there may be an anxiety is fundamentally an economic, a question of how people are going to be able to have economic security. And do we need a change of thinking in terms of economic theory, or if economic thinking beyond either Keynesian or Schumpeter or the traditional economic theories? And is that part of the trilateral concern, economics at that theoretical level?
Well, it surely is, to try to come to a general view of some of these matters. And on technological change in employment, I mean, this has certainly been an issue that we've argued about in this country for a long time. I can remember when I was an undergraduate student.
Yes.
It was, there were many people at that stage who argued that technological change would proceed, unemployment would grow, or we would necessarily become a sort of leisure society because there wouldn't be enough work to spread around unless each of us did less work.
That was Robert Theobald.
But the way it's turned out so far is that technological change, while destroying jobs, also creates jobs and creates settings in which new kinds of activities evolve. So we're in this remarkable situation in the United States now where we have
incredible growth.
Instead of having higher unemployment rates than we did for most of the post-war era. We've got unemployment rates that are among the lowest that we've had. So it's not obvious that technological change destroys the total or lowers the total amount of employment in society, though it certainly does displace particular kinds of jobs that don't last as long as they would have in an earlier era. I grew up in a town that was, my father had his career in a steel company.
Right.
And to see how the acceleration of technological change and how steel is made from the time I was a boy is just amazing. And it means that steel companies now don't need nearly as many employees as they did when I was a boy. But there are lots of other kinds of employment that have grown up since that time.
And that will serve us in terms of as we move into the future. That will serve us, and that's on an international scale. That the distribution of income to the mass of the population by labor criteria will serve well the macroeconomic needs of the nation and the world, and we don't have to address the issue of who owns the technology or the ownership issue, which is, we do have a world. Mr. Carter, who's a trilateralist, was asked by a journalist one time, we live in a world, is the world just? And of course you'd have to say, no, of course it's not just. We don't live in a just world, but the trendings of that. And Mr. Boutros Ghali will say that half the world population has never made a phone call, and then also that that half the population, nearly half the population, lives on an income of $1 a day.
Right.
So we have great problems in terms of those questions of I don't know, loosely justice or the economic, and yet we have an economic potentiality, a technologically augmented economic potentiality. David Brinkley every night tells us on the NewsHour that there's no problem with food. It's only a problem with economics and politics in terms of getting the system to be able to do what it's capable of doing. We're not selling ourselves short in terms of what we would be able to do because we're holding to ideas that aren't as workable as those what a new vision might be introducing us to or something. That's what I'm trying to get at. The avenues towards sort of new thinking beyond the traditional paradigm, and perhaps it's not needed. Perhaps the traditional way will see us through.
Well, to circle back to an early part of what you just said, we do have to worry about ownership, and we do have to worry about distribution. I mean, those are somewhat separate issues, then, though related to the employment issue. I mean, we have found that in net terms, I mean, our unemployment rate has gone down, but that doesn't mean that our distribution of income is getting more and more even. I mean, over the last few decades, although there has been some improvement in the last few years, I mean, the distribution of income in our own society has worsened. I mean, the disparities have widened. So, that issue isn't going to take care of itself necessarily, and certainly, I mean, we still need things like antitrust policy, and it's interesting to think about how that applies internationally.
Yes, indeed.
If that's an issue of ownership or of regulation. So there are there are a tremendous number of very big issues here, and I guess perhaps the lesson from the technology issue that we were talking about is that things are not necessarily going to work out badly. I mean, there are opportunities. There are some positive developments that have emerged out of these tremendous changes.
Oh, no doubt.
So that but we need to keep working at them. And at least in my own, from my own personal perspective, we can't expect an impersonal market in some sense to take care of everything. We still need governments, we still need community institutions, we still need public policy, I mean, in order to steer this dynamism in constructive directions, including some of the directions that you were talking about. So I mean, and that's one of the things I think that we Americans sometimes don't realize about our own society, that part of the strength of this society are the institutions, are the rule of law that exists in this country.
Oh, no doubt.
And that provide a framework then for economic and technological dynamism to be reasonly constructively channeled.
And we are in a position, excuse me, I didn't mean to, but and we are in a position, you said after the Second War, we were incredible. 50% of the domestic product of the world was ours, and we've been consistently 30% throughout the history of this century, more or less. But that we are in a position now of being overwhelmingly, they use the term now, hyperpower. Economic, political, military, unchallenged now. The United States sets a medal. Some people are worried about cultural over-encroachment and that sort of thing, but we're in that position. And
I don't like that word, by the way.
You do not like that.
No,
Could you address but it's perceived that we are in that position now and able to have a tremendous input in terms, impression upon the way the earth is going to be organizing itself in its various political domains.
That is certainly the perception, but I think it's really greatly overblown.
You do. Okay, interesting.
If you look at the economic side, for instance, I mean, it is true that the American economy has performed remarkably well in the last decade relative to Europe, relative to Japan. So we are a somewhat bigger piece of the international economy now than we were 10 years ago, but we're nowhere near what we were in those first decades after the Second World War.
Well, the world was devastated.
So we are...
we presented a model to the world. The Marshall Plan was incredibly enlightened,
The world economy is a much more diverse and multipolar place these days.
Yes,
Than it was back then. So to say that that we somehow rule the world economy or are a hyperpower in economic terms, I think is not a correct statement.
You do not think, in economic terms, you do not think it is. We lead in software and in the information technologies and the cultural.
It's not to say we're not a leader. I mean, we have been the leading economic force in the last 10 years. But to stretch that into saying that we are a hyperpower in economic terms, in the way that the Frenchman that developed that word used that word, I think is quite an exaggeration. And in military terms, it is certainly the case that we're way out ahead of everybody else.
And we can wage war with virtually, in Kosovo or in the Gulf, we can wage war with virtually, we can extend power with virtually no loss of life. With these extended capabilities that we have with the missiles and that sort of thing. That's pretty interesting new territory that we're in.
It is, but in other ways it doesn't. But in other ways it doesn't mean as much as it did earlier. I mean, when we were in the Cold War era and we were in competition with the Soviet Union, the Europeans and the Japanese, to talk of other folks involved in the Trilateral Commission,
yes, indeed.
I mean, needed us more than they do now to face this fundamental challenge in the Cold War. Now we don't have that kind of centralized challenge. We need to worry about the Kosovos of the world or the Saddam Husseins of the world, but in a way, Europe and Japan don't need our military strength in as deep a way as they did when we all faced a common Cold War enemy.
Right. And that creates new problems. In a certain sense.
Creates new problems. But I worry that we exaggerate our own singularity sometimes too much. Exaggerate that and that some of this talk of hyperpower feeds that. And I would hope that we proceed in the world a little bit more
modest than that. A little more than that. Well, perhaps so. Yeah, I wasn't thinking that, but I was just thinking that there are certain things that the United States has. In many ways, it's an amalgam of the world. You come to New York, you've got virtually everyone here in almost in a unique sort of way. It seems to me the United States is an amalgam state, and the United States is advanced in many, many ways in terms of the leading edge technology and so forth. So the model and the cultural reach of the United States, some people are concerned about that, is very strong. And it may be that while we want to be modest, but we at the same time, in the name of universal principles or something, do want to say, well, certain principles do apply. Democracy. We do want to have democracy. We do not particularly want to cotton to the, traditional rule of power by a small oligarchy, something like that. There are certain principles, and some of those principles are very American in their nascent, in their development. And while we want to be modest, but let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Right? Also.
That's true.
And some of those principles are included within the trilateral charge, I would think, in terms of the organizing raison d'etre, or
yes, they are
philosophical principles.
They are indeed, and you're absolutely right that the United States is a remarkable society.
It is,
and a leading society in a number of ways. Though,
but it may not be. It may be that it is not. It's not perfect.
That's
right. And it may need some changes yet within it. If it's going to be setting in some sort of a way, it or its trilateral part, some sort of a model that really is comprehensively appropriate to the way the world's going to work, there may be some problems yet that we shouldn't be complacent in terms of how well we've worked out our own system and way of relating politically or economically with one another. Then maybe we're overly complacent in terms of not looking for some alternatives within our own way of operating.
And it's
That's
also
an avenue toward humility.
Right. And it's also the case that the way we do things here, I mean, will not necessarily apply in another society right now. So that's another part of
but there's some
modesty.
Universals that we want to move.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Justice and fun.
But we have to make sure we grasp the universals rather than grasp a particular American way of doing things isn't the only way of expressing the universal.
When we had the Asian crisis of 80 or 97 and so on, there was called, what's it, the Asian, there was a view of the international financial thing, there was an Asian view or something like that.
Yes.
Some people looked at that, Mandarin people in Malaysia, and so some people thought that that was, you know, an inappropriate way for them to try and view that there were needs in terms of the financing of the world that had to be addressed in universal principles. We only got a couple minutes. That was an important issue. Asia is a thing you're directing at. But is that one of the examples of where that there were examples? There were.
That's one of the most interesting parts of the world to look at in this sense, because there has been this fascinating debate in East Asia over the last decade or two about Asian values, in contrast to Western values.
And the Western values are put forth in certain universal principles in terms of the way the financial arrangement of the world is going to be done.
Yes, so in some ways the development of the notion of Asian values was a reaction to folks that wanted to project so-called Western values in somewhat insensitive ways. But you would find many Asians that would themselves think that Asia is incredibly diverse and full of different kinds of values itself, and that the notion of Asian values was overdone, and that we do indeed all need to reach for universal values and you know, see through some of the things the Americans or in particular might want to throw at us, but to look at what's happening in East Asia in connection to this whole debate is absolutely fascinating, and the financial crisis and how it related to that
really
to that
things
sense.
Up. Well, that's one subject that we could go into for about 4 or 5 hours. I'm afraid we don't have much time. You know, it's just interesting. We just got the genome. The genome is that it gives a whole, there's 100 trillion cells in the human organ, 100 trillion cells. Each one is semi-permeable, and the overall system constitutes, they're all in communication through the DNA with every other cell. There's epidermal cells, all kinds of cells, and so, you know, I don't know if that's a metaphor, and they're semi-permeable, each of the cells. I don't know if it's a sort of metaphor, but we do live, the Hindus have been telling us for a long time that there are no academic disciplines, that we live in a seamless web, and the world is a seamless web of which we are a part. And the Trilateral Commission is one of those who's tried to bring those things together, it seems to me, with great responsibility, and I congratulate you and your colleagues on it. You know, sorry we've run out of time, but it's been your pleasure to have the Perceptions here. Charles Heck, and he's North American director. We only just got a chance to scratch the surface, but there's 3 directors on a trilateral basis in Europe and in Asia now, as it was Japan. And it's a very interesting organization, one that we encourage you to go to their website. We'll give you the address at the end. You can go to their website and investigate some of their work and what they're doing. We on Conversations invite you to tune in. It's been we invite you to tune in. We'll come back same time next week. That's it for this particular program. Charles Heck, once again, thank you very much for coming in for all your work.
My pleasure, Harold.
Until next time.
Yeah. You know, I brought for you,
yes.
You had asked me to bring a membership list and buy it.
The first camera that we ever had was Sony off the boat from Japan way back in 1969. Made it possible for an independent, because that was a piece of technology that made it possible for an individual to make a program. Otherwise, it had always been institutional, you know, big institutional things. So we were able to do that. That was good then. No, I've talked to my hero was Fuller.
Yes.
I love Bucky Fuller.
I noticed he was on one of the things that you had sent me with some of your own experience over the years as a geography teacher and so forth, that when you listed at the bottom the people that you had spoken to, I think you had Buckminster Fuller right up there at the top.
Well, I had Bucky Fuller, and I used to like Marshall McLuhan and Teilhard de Chardin. And then the thing that got me off the track, or off into a different vineyard or something like that, is I've been very taken with this fellow Louis Kelso. I have a thing I'll give you. I don't know if you'd want it or not, because it's a small thing, but he's the one.